connected so you don't miss any of this amazing event that we have for you today. We're really excited about it. I'm Sarah, by the way. I'll introduce myself again in just a moment, but I lead DevRel here at Sentry, and I'm excited to have this conversation with some amazing folks. So if you're joining us from Zoom or from YouTube, wherever you're joining us from, feel free to engage in the chat. We have folks who are monitoring the chat in all places. So go ahead and say hello. You could say where you're from. I'm coming from a little bit of a rural area in Washington State, and knocking on wood, it's going to be a little bit cooler today. But it looks like we have folks from all around the world. Another person's in Spain, Sweden, India, Belgium, Greece, Romania. Welcome, welcome. South Texas, Glasgow. I've been to Glasgow. It's a beautiful place. Awesome. All right. I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. My name is Sarah Guthels. I lead DevRel here at Sentry. And today we have an incredible conversation with 4 amazing experts in backend. I mean, they are essentially all like full stack experts, but more recently, they have been focusing a lot on supporting developers through frameworks and tools and languages on the back end. So we're going to have some awesome conversations today with all of them. I'm going to introduce everyone to you briefly. And as I introduce folks, they're each going to give you a very short developer horror story that they've encountered, maybe when they've broken something or maybe found something that was broken. So first, I'm going to introduce Paul. Paul is the CEO and co-founder of Supabase, Supa, not super, an open source alternative to Firebase. And it just GA'd a couple months back, right? That's awesome.
Yeah, after
congratulations
4 years,
again.
so
yeah, that's
took our
awesome.
time.
Congratulations. No, it's good. It means it's really ready. Paul has been a full stack developer for nearly 20 years, and about 8 years ago, he kind of went more into startups and came up with the concept for Supabase back in 2020. Paul, what is your dev horror story?
Yeah, I think, well, it has to be in databases, right? So actually, I started my career kind of doing support for a company, and I learned some pretty bad habits from one of the people training me. When they needed to see what was happening in a customer account, they would copy a like hash of a password, put it into theirs, and the password was change me. And so me, being a young, naive database developer, did that. It wasn't just a copy and paste, it's an update statement. But of course, I forgot the where clause on one of them and managed to update every single password in the database to change me. So that's when I learned the power of point in time backups, and we managed to restore it for us. But everything started crashing at that point because it turns out that a lot of the system accounts were just user accounts in the database as well. So yeah.
That's a good one. That's a good one. A good one, a bad one.
It's a terrible one,
story.
but
It's a
I feel
terrible one,
like,
but a good story.
yeah, doing something to a database is a rite of passage. So I'm glad I started
Yeah,
there.
sure. Yeah, at least it didn't happen much later. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us. Excited to hear more about Supabase and databases. Next, we have Soren. Soren is the CEO of Prisma, which is an open source next generation ORM that makes working with databases easy for application developers. Soren has been a developer and software architect for nearly 20 years. Welcome, Soren. Do you have a short developer horror story?
I do, thank you. 20 years, that makes me feel old. My horror story involves me and my team spending the majority of our company Halloween party dressed as scary clowns and zombies. And we were frantically passing through binary database files because a primary production database had crashed and we didn't have working backups. Well, we thought we had backups, but just turned out to not really be working. 12 years ago, we were running a pre-release version of Mongo because it had some shiny feature we really needed. So we built this functionality, we got it out there, and it worked great. So we just let it sit, and it worked great for a year until that fateful Halloween party. It just didn't work so great anymore. So my learning from that is, well, don't run pre-release software in production. And if you do, then don't do it for too long. and test your backups, I guess.
Yes, yes, that's a good lesson for sure. It's so hard, I feel, with wanting to be using kind of the most cutting edge or newest things and take advantage and not just kind of take advantage, but use them so then that way you can see where you can push whatever you're building forward, but also trying to make sure that it's stable. It's definitely a hard balance there. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Soren. Taylor is next. Taylor is the founder of Laravel, an open source PHP framework for web artisans. I love the way that tagline is. Taylor has been coding since he was a child and launched Laravel 13 years ago. Taylor, do you have a 1-minute dev horror story?
Yeah, so I definitely have a scary story. This was at my first job, which I didn't start my career as a PHP developer. I started on an even cooler language called COBOL. And I was working at a big publicly traded freight company here in the US, 22-year-old developer, kind of fresh out of college. And one of my first big projects was rewriting the COBOL program that routed every truck to the correct terminal around the country. So you plug in a zip code, you get back a trucking terminal, like very simple inputs and outputs. But this thing is called, I don't even know how many thousands of times a day. So it's a very important piece of the company, and the first like major thing I ever shipped into production. And while nothing went wrong, it was definitely the scariest night of my life, sleeping by my landline telephone, which they made us have in case something went wrong during the night and they needed to get a hold of us. I don't think I slept more than about 30 minutes that night because I pictured every truck in America going to the wrong terminal and I would get sued and go to jail or something like that. So anyway, I woke up I went to work the next morning, and thankfully the business was still running, but definitely a very scary night.
That is terrifying. That it's like, back when I was in college, I wanted to be a medical doctor, and then I switched to computer science, and my joke was always like, well, at least no one will die and like that is kind of not, maybe not death, but like still up there. That's a lot of responsibility for sure. I don't think I would have slept that night either. Well, thank you so much, Taylor, for joining us. Excited to hear more about Laravel. And last but certainly not least, we have Yagis. Yagis is a member of the Node.js Technical Steering Committee, the founder of the Node.js Performance Team, and an OpenJS Foundation Cross-Project Council voting member. Those are lots of big words. Yagis has been a full stack developer for many years, and really excited to kind of hear about the way that you influence Node. Do you have a horror story for us today, Yagis?
Yeah. So I'm going to share with you the most recent one, I guess, because the most recent is always the worst, right? So last year, around May or something, so as a result of this community group called WinterCG, there are new APIs that get implemented in Node.js in other and like other runtimes as well. And as a result, I selected one of the new APIs called like navigator.hardware concurrency. And at that time, we didn't have a navigator class in Node.js. So I thought that, yeah, let me select the most easiest one that doesn't get, that won't create a lot of discussion around it, so that we can ship navigator. And then when the time comes, we can ship the rest of the functionality. So as a result, I landed navigator hardware concurrency on June, and I labeled it as a December major, meaning that whenever Node.js 21 comes in, it's going to get released at that time. And then I had my first kid, and basically like things have passed, and we literally forgot that we landed navigator. And Node.js 21 came, and it broke every API out there, because everybody was checking if whether or not the runtime that runs this particular code is Node.js or not. They were checking if navigator exists. And according to if navigator exists, they were checking navigator.user agent. If it includes certain keyword, then it's that. But we didn't have navigator user agent. So but we had navigator. So then, yeah, I literally broke every piece of framework based on Node.js at that time. Yeah.
I feel like someone needs to have a tool to help people after they come back from parental leave because I feel that for real. It's like everything changes and remembering all the things is tough. That's a horror story for sure. Well, thank you so much, Yagis. We're going to jump right into the conversation here. I want to start with Soren and Paul, if that's okay with you all. But of course, Taylor and Yagis are welcome to kind of pipe in if they have something that they want to share on this one. As hopefully you all know, Sentry cares a lot about performance. We obviously are known for our kind of error tracking, but when it comes to performance, we also have, full tracing from front end to back end, and connecting performance issues to other issues that you might have throughout your application. So I kind of wanted to start there, kind of around performance. And for Soren and Paul, what are some of the key factors for achieving either a high performant database or making it easier for developers to engage with high performant databases or make calls or write code that is really write code that is performant that engages with databases is the sentence I was looking for.
Thanks, Andrew. I think that's a great question. Performance really is a feature. We should deliver fast apps to our users. I'm super curious to hear what you have to say, Paul, because you're operating lots and lots of databases. But I'll just go and say a few things first. I think the first thing is to just realize that modern hardware is extremely fast. So most people probably don't need anything fancy. A Supabase project can do thousands of requests per second, no problem. And if you need more than that, well, that's great. Then you can go and do more things. I think when throwing hardware at the problem becomes too expensive, and that's usually the reason that you want to optimize things. It just gets too expensive. It always comes down to this one thing: do less work. It's always you're making the computer do too much work, and sometimes it's not obvious how you're causing the computer to do all that work. But that's your job as a developer. Go figure out what are you doing that is causing the computer to do all of that work, and then make it not do that, make it do something else. So to start simple with databases, if you have a query that scans a full table, well, you can only do that so many times a second, 10 times a second, 1 time a second, maybe. But if you can apply an index that can point directly to the correct data, now you can do 100 times or 1,000 times as many requests per second, simply by doing less work. We're working on a tool right now we call Prisma Optimize. I think it will launch in a couple of weeks. I'm really excited for this. It uses OpenTelemetry to just ingest all of your database queries and then produce recommendations for how you can make the computer do less work. Apply indexes, change your queries, change your schema maybe. So that's super cool. Another approach to consider is to reduce the amount of data involved in serving a query. And the traditional approach to this is it's a little bit complex, I think, but it is to introduce sharding. It's a system to automatically say some of the data lives on this server, some of the data lives on that server. So if you have 20 shards, now every single query has to process that much less data, and it's faster. Some companies are pushing this to the extreme. Laravel has D1, there's Terso, and the idea here is, well, don't just have 20 shards, have a database per user. So if you have 1 million users and you have 1 million databases, but each database is tiny. So do you have an index or not? Doesn't really matter because there isn't very much data to process. So we're using this to great effect in some of our products. So do less work, reduce the amount of data you need to process. I think those are the key things.
I like that. Do less work. I think it's like you said, it's kind of so simple, but very I would rephrase it as like be intentional with the work that you're asking a computer to do, right? It's kind of the same thing. It's think about it a little bit. Paul, how do you all approach this from the Supabase side?
Yeah, for context, we host Postgres databases, which is, I guess, the relevant thing here. Yeah, I think, I mean, you can choose a database, exactly like Soren said, most modern hardware is good, and actually most databases are baseline good. So as long as you're choosing one where there aren't too many abstractions away from, you want to get sort of close to the metal as you can, then you've got baseline a lot of performance. And typically the, how do you achieve high performance is really going to be case dependent. Is your situation read heavy? Is it write heavy? Is it OLTP data? Is it OLAP? All of these things actually matter. You typically might start treating your database like a dumb data store, and then, 6 months from now, it turns out that it's not. So these are the things that you probably want to focus on, maybe on the later stages. And generally, we advise at Supabase that you just start simple and you don't go too heavy on all the optimizations that you can do. Just start building, and then actually, as the database is getting used, actually, funnily enough, one of the most important things is monitoring, like Sentry. So seeing how those workloads happen, and then from there, you want the tool that gives you many options. So Postgres obviously has this. You've got indexes, partial indexes, you've got read replicas. Yeah, as Soren said, some sort of sharding can be built in, materialized views, caching, partitions, you name it. There's just any variety of tools that you can mix and match just to make sure that, your particular use case is going to be solved. And really, we see all of them across the board. For a lot of RAG use cases, it's partial indexes. For some customers, it's partitions. And really, it is very use case dependent. We provide some tools here as well. So we've released some index advisors. After a while of using your database, we give you a hypothetical index. If you apply this index, your query might be 98% faster, something like this. And so you can get a lot of this tooling out of Postgres itself. And of course, we lean very heavily on the Postgres tooling. So yeah, I think hard for me to speak to other systems, but I do like the configurability and flexibility of Postgres to give you, depending on your use case, the tools that you need to get the job done.
That makes a lot of sense. I think that what you both said kind of align, right? Like, do less work. And that also means don't overcomplicate it from the beginning. Wait and to see kind of where your slowdowns are, or where, where you can optimize and where it makes sense to optimize for your use case. And maybe that from the beginning. But I would argue that oftentimes it's not until something is running and you've got lots of users and you realize, oh, wait, that's how they are using this. I didn't expect that to happen. So yeah, I really like that. And speaking of kind of performance, I want to take this now to like the performance of developers, if you will, developer productivity, and how we can help developers stay performant in their developer workflow. So this question is for Paul and Taylor, Taylor from Laravel. Exactly that, I would say, is what are your top recommendations for improving developer productivity, maybe specifically for backend development, but whether it's tips and tricks, or whether it's how you've your philosophy around developer productivity and developer workflow fit into what you're building. Any advice there?
Yeah, sure. I guess I'll jump in first. And how I guess we think of developer productivity at Laravel kind of goes back to the very beginning of how I first started the framework 13 years ago or whatever it is now, where I had a day job and I had a bunch of startup ideas that I wanted to build, and I just needed a quick way to prototype them, to launch them, to build them. I actually never really used PHP before, but I knew that it was like easy to host, easy to write. So I was like, hey, I'll dabble in this, Of course, I need to create my own framework first. That's like first order of business, so that I have the starting point for building these ideas. And so Laravel is very much like, at its heart, I would say, geared for letting one developer build a full stack modern web application as quickly and as enjoyably as possible, hopefully. So there's a couple ways we do that. I mean, one is to offer or try to offer a comprehensive solution to most problems that backend developers are going to face. So this would be in contrast, I guess, a little bit to ecosystems where maybe you kind of have to patch together various libraries to kind of build your own preferred stack. So Laravel has out of the box things like database migrations, things like authentication, things like input validation, even things like queuing and sending notifications and working with WebSockets. And that's all sort of built in. And then we have a vast library of kind of first-party packages that you can pull in for things like working with Stripe to manage subscriptions or working with Redis to manage load balanced queues. And then also on the front end, we have things like Laravel Livewire, which is inspired by Elixir's, the Phoenix framework in Elixir, their live view solution, which lets you write modern reactive front ends, sort of with minimal JavaScript, mainly in PHP. And then I would also say that Laravel at the same time is definitely not anti-JavaScript. So we have tools like Inertia.js, which lets you pair a modern TypeScript, React, or Vue or Svelte code base on the front end with your Laravel backend kind of in one monolithic code repository and deploy it all at the same time. So we try to accommodate a lot of different use cases, but overall give developers the tools they need to build most kinds of web applications out of the box in a very batteries included kind of way. Some of the other things we try to focus on to increase developer productivity is having great documentation. And I encourage, like, if you want to level up as a developer and you're using a tool, I would just read all of the docs from like front to back, like a book, whether that's Laravel or Prisma or whatever. I just think that's a great way to get everything in context and really understand the tool. And we just try to be very developer friendly, very conscious of what the community needs and what developers are asking for and kind of what they're struggling with, and try to make things as easy as possible.
That makes a lot of sense. I like the idea of just kind of reading the docs like a book, just to at least get that context. I always just start getting distracted in building, and then I forget to finish 99% of the docs, which is another way to learn, I guess. But yeah, and I think that kind of ties really well into kind of what Paul was just saying around build what you need first, right? It seems like for Laravel, it's like let's build the batteries included, everything that you'll need, and then if you have specialty things, we'll build kind of plugins or whatever for that to make it easier.
Totally.
Paul.
Yeah. Well, we were
What
joking
about
before
you?
the call that it sounds like you should just use Laravel with Supabase, and then you've got Postgres. And but yeah, I think we've got a very similar philosophy. It's hard to answer this question without talking about the tooling itself. Oh, did my camera just turn off, or something has happened? Can you still hear me?
We still hear you.
Okay, great. Don't know what happened there, but it's hard to talk about it without talking about the tooling, right? So we obviously offer a Postgres database, and then we have these additional tools on top. And the idea is that Postgres is the substrate, and then you've got whatever tool you want to use on top if you want it. We don't care, actually. So a really good example, if you use Laravel with Supabase, then we've got these auto-generated APIs that you can use. You can point it towards any schema inside your database, and it'll auto-generate an API for you, which is kind of a neat side effect. We've got auth products, we've got storage products, all of it kind of maps down into your Postgres database. So this is nice. I think, like, generally, I mean, of course, I'm going to talk about the tools, but the recommendations around, developer productivity really center around what type of developer you are. If you're an indie dev and you're building a side project, then you kind of want to be as full stack as possible. If you're more along the enterprise side, then maybe you want to be a little bit more specialized. And, at Supabase, we try to center our teams around being quite full stack, product-driven developers. It looks like I'm going to have to just change my video right now. And so that there's basically very little handoff between the teams, and that helps with productivity a lot. So I think having tools like Laravel, for example, minimize the handoff, and when there is handoff, everyone in the team has the same sort of context around it. So I think that's good. If you've got tools that just get out of your way so that you can ship things to your customers, that's the number one part of what your team should be focused on. And if you've got tools that can do that, then you know you're in a good spot.
Yeah. No, I think that makes a lot of sense. I think
and AI, of course. I
oh,
forgot
of
we're
course,
supposed
of
to
course.
talk about AI. So
yes,
as long as you got tools
AI.
with AI in them, they should be super productive.
The solution to everything.
Yeah.
The silver bullet. We got it. Yeah, no, I think that it makes a lot of sense, right? It's kind of this idea of we're not necessarily just front end or back end developers anymore. We kind of all need to be somewhat of a full stack developer, even if you're not necessarily touching all the code. I liked what you said, Paul, about making that handoff as easy as possible, right? And I think, you know, at Sentry, just last week, we launched a bunch of new features to support folks debugging with tracing. And that's part of it, right? Is making sure that we understand as developers, maybe this issue is showing up on the front end, but it's actually a back end issue, and how can you quickly resolve it without, you know, all of the confusion. Okay, I kind of want to shift this conversation slightly around how do we avoid building in a black box? Some of you have already touched on this a little bit, but Yagis and Taylor, I want to ask you specifically, how has community feedback influenced the evolution of Node and Laravel? And there's like a side question here of like, you know, what about open source and how do you kind of engage there? So yeah, if you want to take this one.
Go for it, Yagis.
Okay, I was waiting for you and you were waiting for me. So yeah, so as you know, like I'm a Node.js technical steering committee member. That means that I'm in the committee that decides whether when two different contributors have a conflict and they wanted to resolve it and they want to make sure that the decisions are taken into consideration and not with any emotional or any other issues. So before answering this question, I want to emphasize the size of Node.js and the impact of Node.js, because in 2023, in terms of Docker images that gets pulled from the official sources, it got downloaded 5 billion times, and the total count of downloads, according to the Node.js.org website, is 6.5 billion times. This means that almost every single device that you use or that you see uses Node.js one way or another, including TVs, mobile devices, and so on and so forth. So for Node.js, having this much amount of size has a lot of impact and a lot of responsibility. But one of the really good side that I see is that the community owns the project. This means that there's no project management, there's no roadmap, there's no central decision making. There is only individual members who are interested on shipping and improving a free software. For example, if you want to add a new library, you can just open a pull request and add that. If you want to add Node SQLite, if you want to introduce something else, you can just open and do it. The only way that falls between you and your contribution and getting merged is the ability to convince others that this contribution is benefit the humanity, meaning literally every single device that uses it, and it follows certain principles and standards. And this is one of the most defining characteristics of Node.js development process, for better, for worse, of course. But yeah, and I am one of those, not the decision holders, but conflict resolution personnel that works as a buffer between two different contributors having two different insights.
That must be challenging.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
For us, I think it's pretty similar in the sense that we don't really have like a public roadmap necessarily. I think we have ideas internally, or maybe in my head, of what I would like to put in Laravel eventually, but a lot of the work is really driven by what people are interested in, in the community. Anyone can just open a PR on GitHub. And I think, the challenge for me over the years has been, since I built Laravel basically for myself, and when I first launched it, I was totally cool if no one else used it. It was just something like I built and was having fun with. while it wasn't like an overnight sensation, people did end up using it. And so then it's become like kind of a learning experience of like, what if the community wants to put something in the framework that like I wouldn't personally put in the framework, and kind of balancing what the community needs with what maybe I personally want or would use. So I just try to get like a wide variety of community feedback. So that could be everything from like indie hackers that are just kind of solo bootstrapping their stuff, all the way up to large enterprise organizations, that have adopted Laravel and what they need to be more productive with Laravel. And trying to kind of balance those two use cases can be challenging at times because it's very different needs typically. So I just try to walk that line, but I mean, still to this day, I am the only one that merges pull requests into the framework. So every day I start my day with like an hour of GitHub time where I'm working pull requests and either merging or closing. And, typically if I see the community bring up an idea the first time, I may not give it a ton of weight if it's just from like one suggestion from one person, but then I keep seeing it coming up over and over and over a period of months or even a year or more. Then it's like, okay, well, maybe there's something to this, maybe it has legs, and, we'll merge it in. But the community's been awesome. That's one of the coolest things about open source is you see someone just take a real interest in a particular part of the project. Like maybe they're really interested in the ORM or they're really interested in authentication, and they contribute lots of helpful stuff in that area for a couple of years, and then maybe they move on to a different field or a different job, and someone else comes in and fills in the gap. But that's sort of the awesome thing about open source, is working with so many cool people from the community.
Yeah. Do you all think, just a quick follow-up, do you all think that it would be possible to get the same level of engagement, but maybe more so like just understanding of your community without being open source?
I think for me, I think people want to feel like a part of something, you know what I mean? Like in life. And so when Laravel first started getting popular, that's something that I really tried to foster, is this sort of like, we're all working on sort of this shared passion that we have, and it all makes us like connected in some way. That it feels like cheesy to say that, but I think it is like genuinely something that resonates with people in open source. They feel like they're like an insider that's contributing to this really cool tool that we're all benefiting from. It's like a good feeling, so I think probably no, it wouldn't have had the same impact, or growth if it was closed source and people couldn't feel that like personal connection to having their name on the contributor list, which I think is really cool for people.
So if you look into the Node.js history, you will see that we had a big fork maybe 10 years ago, IOJS, and then getting merged into Node.js at the same time. So we had some sort of history about what would, like in a parallel universe, what would happen if Node.js wasn't open source. And it wasn't, the future wasn't that much bright, I can say for sure. But the issue is, specifically for Node.js, for me, I can say that we all live in a bubble, big or small, and the amount of things that we can learn inside that bubble and grow as a person, as an engineer, as a friend, as a husband, as a wife, and so on and so forth, it's extremely limited. And these kinds of ecosystems like Node.js gives the person the ability to shine, and just like a flower to bloom and learn and to understand more about like being a part of something bigger than yourself, as Taylor said. And for me, it was about working with people a lot more smarter, more enthusiastic, and more knowledgeable than me and anybody that I knew, and having the opportunity to work with them on something and sharing that wisdom, that goal of having a brighter future, a faster future, a more performant, whatever that adjective is something motivating. And open source as well as free software should and will always live unless that ideology behind contributing and joining under one hood and will not end. So
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. I'm a former GitHubber, and so kind of this idea of open source is in my blood. And I think I appreciate that both of you kind of focused on the community and the benefits for the community, not just kind of what they could provide to either Laravel or Node, but rather what making it open source can provide to them and giving them the opportunity to have their name on something and be a part of something. And I think that is really important. And I loved what you said, Yagis, about kind of expanding our own ecosystem a little bit. And when you invite other people's thoughts and ideas into it, you don't just kind of like you were mentioning, Taylor, like maybe there's something you would have never thought to include. But if enough people are kind of mentioning it, maybe it's something that's worthwhile. So awesome. Well, I appreciate that. We're about halfway through this conversation. I can't believe it's going so quickly. I want to talk a little bit about the future now. Taylor, you mentioned AI. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. Specifically, I want to ask Paul and Soren this time, though. How do you feel, and anyone can kind of respond as well, but how do you feel, or how do you feel that the AI and ML technologies that are, sprouting every single day, are going to impact backend systems in the coming years? Or how have they already in your spaces, if they have?
Paul, do you want to go first?
Sure, yeah. Yeah, I think the question, how have they already, is quite interesting. We obviously see a lot of, we were the first to offer PG Vector as the solution for people to use RAG. So we started to see a lot of these use cases. And as a result, actually, we saw a lot of AI applications starting to be built around February last year on Supabase, the platform. So I think the tooling is pretty interesting. And some of the things that we saw as a result of that early positioning and movement was pretty cool, because people kind of like Devin, I don't know if you've seen it, it's you instruct it what to do, and because of this, it can kind of build an entire application just by giving it an instruction. So I think the future is pretty cool. It's still a way off, in my opinion. So in the immediate term, I think every database is now offering embeddings and vectors. That seems obvious. It's a new data type. That's just how it's going to be. Second wave is just going to be a bunch of AI tooling built into the existing systems that we've got. You already see that coming in. And then as a result, people are building a lot faster. And then the third wave, which is, I guess, going to be a lot further away, but who knows how long it is more like that Devin workload workflow where you can basically instruct a agent or whatever it is to build something for you. At the moment, they're building parts of a system for you, but maybe that part will get bigger and bigger. And I had an interesting question from someone around how we would end up treating agents on Supabase, and like, would we make them a user? Would they log in? These things I find very interesting. I think it's a bit far-fetched at this stage, but obviously some workflow where you're working very closely with code generation tools is making things very interesting. So a really key insight, I think here, that because I come from a Postgres world, and actually it was shared to me from one of our community members. They said they really liked working with Postgres or one of the more structured databases with agents, because agents can be a bit more unstructured, or with large language models, not so much agents. And because you set the contract in your database right down the bottom, then you have this nice workflow between an LLM, which can create some output. You try to stuff it into your database, it will reject it, and then it'll come back out, and then the LLM can correct it and put it back in. So I think that's quite neat. And what we're starting to see is a lot of this tooling being built up, even from ourselves, through this sort of workflow between back and forward several times from an LLM and the database itself.
That's super interesting. I feel like this is something that me and my team have been talking about a lot, which is kind of the difference between a coder and an engineer. And this isn't to shame anyone at all, but to say that we all mentioned it earlier, be intentional with what you're building, don't necessarily just throw everything at it, focus on what you want to build and why. And I feel like that shift that you just described too, right? Like taking data and having an LLM help you just kind of properly get it into the database, and you kind of focusing on what is the actual like usage of that data, how, like, why, what are you trying to store, what are you trying to use that data for in the future? That's going to have to be very intentional moving forward, if we're going to start to see AI help kind of make those calls and people not writing all of their queries themselves necessarily. So that'll be really interesting. I'm curious about that. Soren, do you have any opinions on AI? Have you heard of? No, I'm just kidding.
Thought it looked like you had a follow-up comment to one.
No, just yeah, I saw a really cool one on that one. So on Twitter just today, kind of highlighted their create table statement, and then they just said, "Oh, can you generate a CRUD React component out of this?" And it just generated the entire file for them, which I think that's cool. I mean, whether you're a coder or an engineer, I would do that when I'm getting started, right? So I think that's just it's just becoming extremely productive to mix and match these tools, which is exciting.
We had this super interesting point in history where we have this new awesome capability with the LLMs, the large language models. But the computer can go and do creative work. That's pretty crazy. But when you go and try it, it also turns out to be pretty useless if you don't figure out how to really direct it in the right way. So we are all really churning through this work right now where we're trying to figure out how to direct the LLM to do something useful. In many tasks, they're more than like 50% right, so they're a little bit useful, but they do all of this bullshit all the time. And you touched on this, Paul. You said that the schema of the relational database is really helpful because it will tell the LLM, nope, what you tried to do is wrong. And then you can have some code that makes the LLM go and try to reason about that and look up the docs maybe and go and try again. So as an industry, we're all going through this right now. We're trying to figure out how do we direct these language models to do something useful, something we can rely on. And this AI developer Devin is an interesting example of that. It does that, right? It writes code, runs the compiler, gets the errors, maybe goes and looks in the documentation, it tries again. And if we can get the creativity and the correctness high enough, well, then we get to a point where they can do most of the work of a normal developer, or at least the developer can become a lot more productive by directing these language models to go and do work for them. So a question I get pretty often, it goes something like this. Given AI is here and it's only getting better, AI can write code. One, will there be developers in the future if the AI is writing all the code? And two, do we need a great developer experience? Do we need frameworks like Prisma? Because if the AI is writing code anyway, what do we care that it's kind of difficult and tedious to write? And I think the answer to that is that there is an extreme demand for software development work to happen, and it is not being filled. And we know it's not being filled because all of us software developers, we're being paid a lot of money. It's expensive to hire people to go and do software development. So as we become more productive, there will continue to be demand for software development work to happen as much as possible. We as a world, as a society, will just start doing a lot more software development, and we'll need people to oversee that, to direct that. So maybe the next 10 years, we'll see a tenfold explosion in the amount of software development that happens, not because we have 10 times as many people, but because we're becoming more efficient. We are adopting tooling. It's a similar thing that happened when digital photo editing and Photoshop became a thing. We didn't stop having editors and photographers. We just started doing a whole lot more photo editing because now it became easier and cheaper. So I think that'll happen too.
I feel like also it's almost like, you know, owning a car versus taking your car to a mechanic, right? Like if you like, because we have mechanics and we have this whole industry of people who understand what's under the hood and can kind of dive in there and debug it and fix a car, you as an owner don't have to know all of that, right? You can if you want to, but you just need to know how to operate it. And I feel like that's kind of part of. Just a quick follow-up. This was unplanned, but I'm kind of curious. With things like, you know, GitHub Copilot, and your IDE suggesting kind of, hey, let me just write in English what I want and you give me all the code for it. As like tool developers, do you take that into consideration when writing docs now, or are you starting to think about like, how is this going to be suggested, or what code snippets do I want to include? And is that a challenge for you all?
Not a challenge, it's a gift. We have always invested heavily in our docs, and we now have this AI widget thing on the website. You can talk to it. It is much better than ChatGPT at answering Prisma questions because it's been trained on our docs. And we think specifically about how do we put as much useful context in the docs so that these AI things can pick it up and use it when talking to developers. Extremely helpful.
Yeah, I mean, likewise, I think actually we may have been one of the first or the first to add this AI to the docs. It was part of the project at PG Vector. So we also helped Mozilla do this one. And since that point, we actually started writing. The way you do it is you break down your docs by a structure, so a heading. And so because of this, we started writing for that RAG type implementation. And as a result, it's very good for other LLMs to ingest. So I think kind of writing for LLMs, funnily enough, makes good docs as well. So, you end up being very discreet with your answers, very structured with your headings. And it actually turns out to be one of the best ways to tell an engineer to rewrite a page is say, well, go write it so that an LLM can ingest it.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, I want to shift this conversation. Soren and Yagis, I have a question for you all. What do you feel like is the next big trend or innovation in backend development?
Oh yeah, because I feel like this is a big one for you. Yeah, I'm curious what you have.
Yeah. So definitely there's lots of things happening in the JavaScript ecosystem, new runtimes popping, the shift towards development and like the correlation between Moore's law and the performance of how Node.js and like other JavaScript runtimes are evolving. It's definitely a lot of changing. But I think that the next big trend is like cross runtime compatibility, which is like if you look into maybe 5-6 years in the past, you will see that before the backend was Node.js. Whenever someone think about developing something, they were thinking about using Node.js. And whenever they were thinking about JavaScript, it was always correlated with Node.js. It still is in some sense, and I think it's going to stay there for a really, really, really long time. Not because of Node.js, but because what it represents and how it's developed and how it doesn't have an ownership and so on and so forth. But you will see, and if you look into maybe the last 2 years in the past, we see that the whole implementations, the new runtimes implementing Node.js as in a way that it makes Node.js a standard, meaning that instead of going for maybe 3 years ago, we were going for WhatVG, we were going for compatibility between the browsers and the backend development, and we were trying to share the functionality between them. Right now, we are looking for, yes, can I use my existing library in this new runtime? And that even though it is like Dino or Bun or Workers or something else, this has become a huge problem that new working groups like WinterCG are popping, and they're trying to fill that gap and trying to standardize everything so that within the same feature set, we don't become vendor locked in as well as technology locked in the next foreseeable future. And it's ensuring that we have a healthy ecosystem that's developed around these runtimes, rather than having 3-5 different runtimes doing the same exact thing. We are focusing on the functionality and the implementation details rather than the API surface that we are facing, which makes it extremely interesting and also extremely hard to foresee what the future will be in a couple of years, I guess.
Yeah, for sure.
I have a slightly different perspective, or maybe a different area that I think about. And so there's this this meme developing on Twitter over the last couple of years that everything is getting more complicated. Backend development is getting complicated. We do all of these crazy things, and I think it's actually the opposite. I think things are getting easier. So what we used to call enterprise patterns, primarily Java and C# backends, are becoming accessible to a much wider audience of full stack developers. It used to be that you had to set up a Kafka cluster and maybe have it hosted online for a minimum of $1,000 a month or something like that. Just to do some of those things that you had to do in a proper backend. You don't have to do all this complicated stuff anymore. There are services that help you with this. If you go and use Cloudflare, for example, they have the concept of bindings. You can create a microservices architecture that is kind of statically linked together. It's much easier to manage. We're doing a similar thing at the Prisma Data Platform, where we give you a combination of Debezium and Kafka all managed for you. It ties into the Prisma ORM. And it starts at $0 per month instead of 1,000, so it's easier to get started and just pay as you go. This is the new world that backend developers are living in, if they choose to live in this world. I think that's exciting. That means it becomes accessible to a much wider audience. It means people can start out being front-end developers, graduate to the full stack thing, and do more and more back-endy things without having to kind of define themselves as nerdy back-end people who don't talk to designers or something. You don't need to have this dichotomy anymore. You can kind of grow into it and build really sophisticated things with not very much time and with very little upfront cost. I think that's super exciting.
Yeah, it's almost like it's not more complicated, or it's not harder, it's easier, but maybe it's perceived as more complicated because you have more options now. Like, it is much easier to do it, and so now you have to actually make the choice, and it's not that hard to try and set something else out. So
the level of ambition is rising, right? What used
Yes.
to take a full team, you can now go and do as a single developer. So you become hungry for more, and then yes, there is complexity in that, but that's cool. You're doing more stuff.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And that leads perfectly into our last question, which is for Yagis and Taylor, which is, can you just be a back-end developer? Should you just be a back-end developer? Does that world, like, is that the future that we are moving more towards a full stack? Or is there still value in just being a back-end developer?
Yeah, I think you can. Like, certainly, I think in the future there will be people that are just backend developers. I think for me personally, I would encourage people to learn a little bit of both. I think Soren actually makes a really insightful point that each individual thing on backend and front end has actually gotten much, much easier in terms of, I mean, when you think of tools like React and tools like Vue and things like Sentry and Stripe and Prisma and Supabase, they solve so many problems so easily, but the ambition is rising, right? But I think I would encourage people to learn a little bit of both, just because it makes you, it gives you the ability to prototype an idea from start to finish, which I think is just like a really good thing to have in your toolkit. If you have an idea for something at your company or something that you want to launch or start, it's really useful if you can at least prototype a front end and prototype a back end. Maybe it's not the best, most scalable, prettiest thing in the world, but it at least lets you see if there's value behind your idea, see if there's market fit behind your idea, and get it out there. I think it's actually easier than ever to do this. I think, thinking back to when I first got started with Laravel, and on the front end, I don't even know what we were like, Knockout.js or something like that. And on the back end, doing things was much more complicated, especially at scale, where now with all of our serverless tech, it's sort of like you don't really have to think about a lot of these things anymore. So yeah, I would encourage people to go for it, to try to learn a little bit of both. Learn some React, learn some Vue, learn some Tailwind, learn some Laravel, and have the full stack under your belt.
I love it. Yagis?
So in order to answer this question, I'm going to give a little bit of what happened in the past 10 years, kind of not a history lesson, but like a reminder for us. Almost 10 years ago, or maybe 15 years ago, there's a new working group called WhatVG happened. And it's a working group founded by the browsers, which is like Google Chrome, Safari, Firefox, and from Internet Explorer guys probably. As a result of this, they came up with a standard around how to unify the APIs so that the front-end developers can use, and it will work with the same way that it will work on different browsers. As a result of this unified standardization, which is as a result, there's also ES modules, URL pattern, file APIs, and so on and so forth. The difference between the front end and the web and the back end became a lot less visible. But at the end, I think the front end and the back end are always going to be different, because if you look into what we need for a backend application and what we need for a front-end application, so you will see that those things are extremely different. Such as in a backend application, you can run an array prototype join and join an array onto a string maybe a million times, because that's what your application needs. But if you look into like Google Chrome development in the last year, you will see that a sophisticated piece of software like Google Chrome optimized that particular software in the last year, even though it was used for more than 15 years. This is as a result because the needs for two different applications are extremely different, and the mindset and what we need to have a performant working implementation is a lot different. But what we are saying is that we are having, for example, URL parsing on both front end and back end is always the same. If you look into fetch, and like Node.js being part of this and developing Undici, having a unified URL parser with different runtimes as well, and other languages such as PHP is also right now thinking about adopting Ada, the URL parser behind Node.js, and different applications that are trying to unify the API structure and the outcome as a result of this consortium of this working group, WhatVG. It's helping for us to reduce the friction between two different worlds. But unfortunately, I think the value to learn both sides and going into a deep dive and understanding what are the do's and don'ts, what are the best practices, what are the worst case scenarios that you will see, is helpful to produce the best product, best technology that you can develop at that particular time.
Yeah. I want to bring you all back on. I think that's a great point, Yagis. I think both you and Taylor kind of said this, which was the idea of being able to fully understand everything that's going on, whether it's so that you can prototype quickly or so that you know the impacts of what you're doing on the front end to the back end or from the back end to the front end. So being able to kind of fully understand that, I think is critical, even if you're not going to be touching that code, right? I can't believe we're already at the hour. I want to thank you all so much for so much insight. Before we sign off, though, we did have a question in the chat, and I figured this would be a great way to end it. Could you each give 30 to 60 seconds of what is 1 to 2 good foundational skills that every developer should know to kind of upskill in the back end? And we'll go ahead and start with Soren.
I think this is more of a life lesson, but don't worry about knowing the stuff and facts and whatever. Just build some resilience. Go and try, fail, do it again. That's really all there is to software development and pretty much anything about.
I like that. Build resilience. Paul.
Yeah. Read the docs and ship early and often.
Yeah. I like it. Taylor?
So one thing that always jumps out to me between developers that are really fast and developers that are not so fast, maybe, is the ability to debug problems quickly. So like if you get an exception, you kind of have a good intuition of what might be going on versus sort of like wandering in the dark. And I'm not sure the best way to level this up. Maybe it's just an experience thing you learn over time. So the second thing I would say is try to not be the smartest person in the room. I feel like every time I've leveled up the fastest, I was working with people that were way smarter than me and were way out of my league and were able to like carry me along and level me up a lot faster than I would have by myself.
I feel like one way to debug faster is to build that resilience, right? Don't be afraid to fail and then debug it. Yeah, I guess.
So I have a different take, which is with the advancement of technology, we're all seeing the rise in ADHD and focusing and getting distracted by every little single thing because of how ads and different products are helping us to shape the next decision we're taking. So I would probably suggest people to focus on one simple thing, whatever that is, big or small, but it's achievable, so that you know the taste of achieving something and completing something. And if you do that, then you will have the confidence in yourself to do the next big thing or not. But you will see that you will complete that. And that is the best feeling in the world, according to me, of course. So yeah, I would only suggest people to focus on something, do their best, complete it, whatever needs to be done, and then go to the next one.
Yeah, I like that. I feel like it's also easier to build that resilience and to debug and to know where to read the docs when you're focused on just one thing first, and then you can kind of grow. And then that's kind of what we started with, right? Like don't just throw the kitchen sink at it. Build with intentionality. Think about what you actually want to build, and don't just add everything just because it's there. So I feel like it all kind of meshes well. I want to thank you all again so much for taking the time to share with us. This recording will be on YouTube, and we'll also have some clips coming out. So for those of you who are watching now, if you want to revisit some of these insights, feel free to do that. And if you're attending live in the Zoom, we're going to send a survey afterwards. So if you enjoyed this conversation, let us know so we can host more of these. But again, thank you all so much, Paul, Soren, Yagas, Taylor, for taking the time. Really appreciate everyone's insights.
Thank you for having
Hope
us.
to do it again soon.
Thanks. A lot of
Thank you
fun.
all for